So next up, we've got Mila. Mila, what up there, Mila? How you doing?
Hi. Oh my God, I'm on the show.
Yeah.
How's it going, guys?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm gonna take you off speaker because sometimes I've heard there's like a feedback, but yeah, I'm doing good. I'm a little nervous, so sorry if my voice sounds a bit shaky.
It's okay. You have nothing to be worried about. John's very calm, and I'm an idiot, so like you'll be just fine.
Oh, that makes two of us. Awesome. I'm calm and an idiot, so it's a good combo.
There you go.
So
what's going on?
One thing I wanted to I wanted to kind of explore an idea that I've been kind of noticing a lot in intellectual spaces, which is like this kind of so I hear you. I've heard on the show before you guys talk about God of the gap, where like there's a and correct me if I'm not describing this correctly, but it's like there's a gap in someone's knowledge, so you fill it with God, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay,
we don't know what the Big Bang was, so therefore God did it, or whatever.
Right. I feel like sometimes I notice on the other end, and I say this almost like as I don't know, self-identifying as an intellectual myself. Like sometimes I notice a lot in a lot of different contexts, people will kind of do this nuance of the gaps where like the conversation will get a little bit complicated, or like there will be a disagreement, and then people kind of fall to where like an explanation like, well, you know, reality is weird, nature is complicated, you know, there's nuance. And I love acknowledging the nuance because, you know, I'm a bit of a nuance freak myself. But I feel like sometimes it's almost viewed as like a conclusion rather than like an entry point to say like explore the nuance of a subject and like explain, okay, well, because of this nuance, like in, you know, once we acknowledge this more complicated picture of reality, this is how the more complicated picture leads me to believe this different conclusion, right? So I think of it more as kind of like an entry point than an exit point. And yeah, it was something I felt like might be worth discussing and just kind of hearing your thoughts on.
Yeah, I think the thing that like so one thing that I see persistently in academia is that people, especially as you get up into like doctoral level stuff, like they are so unbelievably specialized in their area. It's not just that they study dinosaurs. They are studying this dinosaur, and not just this one kind of dinosaur, this one kind of dinosaur in this one location, and not just that one in the one location. They're talking about just the histology of that, and not just but this one over here is doing the ecology of the same dinosaur in the same region. Like, and so like you get in this like unbelievably niche situation where like I really want to talk about the evolution of the humans, and it's like, okay, cool, here's a bioanthropologist. Okay, well, what about like human hands? Oh, well, you got to talk to the hand guy. The hand guy's down the hall. He's the one who knows about, you know what I mean? And so like that's when we get into this is you have these people who are so unbelievably highly specialized, and when you read the literature and when you're trying to learn this stuff, it is so ridiculously finite and niche and like very, very, very focused in on one single thing. And so what happens a lot when people talk about nuance, it's kind of like when a science communicator says things like, you know, there's in summary, or like I'm leaving some stuff out here, or whatever. When somebody says there's a lot of nuance here, what that usually means is this is a massive conversation that I am not having at this moment, so we can get to the damn point. And sometimes it is also used by people who just don't like what that means is I don't know enough about this, but I know there's something more than it, you know, and that's an honest answer. But like, yeah, I don't think it's fair to characterize it, and I don't think you were, but I don't think it's fair to characterize it as saying like we just use the word nuance as an excuse to not think about it anymore. It's just that there is such unbelievably detailed information in every little thing that it would be unproductive to try to have that nuance of a conversation unless you're talking about peers in that field.
Well, see, one of my favorite quotes is from, oh God, I might be sounding like, I might be showing my idiot card here because maybe it's not actually from Einstein. I think that's where I remember it. But it was like, anyways, it's a good quote. It says like, if you really like master the understanding of something, like you should be able to explain it to someone like a 5-year-old, right? And
Yeah.
I almost see like I see it almost like as a challenge or an opportunity that like when something is like a little more complicated or nuanced, like to kind of seize that opportunity to be like, okay, maybe I can, like, simpler explanations, they're easier to spread, right? Like it's why, a more simple narrative around like biological sex or gender is like tends to like catch on really easily, and it's called like common sense, right? Um,
Right.
but like if you take the more, oh, we live in a world where like we need complicated understandings of things to like build bridges or like design technology that like makes our lives easier. So, we don't have to have the everyday person understand like the nuances of how a smartphone works, but like when it comes to like policy or like, public narratives around certain subjects, right? Like, I think it's I don't know, like I see the value in like taking on that more nuanced, complicated explanation and being like, okay, let's explore why that explanation not only is true, but how do we communicate it in a way that's simple and like accessible to people that maybe aren't wouldn't like understand it intuitively.
So I agree.
Go ahead.
I agree with the concept of like, if you really understand something, you should be able to explain it to a child. However, it's important to point out that like what we're talking about there is like explaining the basic idea to a child. That's something you should be able to do. You should not be able to, because no one would be able to explain the actual the nuance we're talking about, right? If I'm talking about like evolution to a kid, you know what I mean? If I'm explaining evolution to a kindergartner, I'm going to talk about just like its change over time. Like if you think about like how cell phones used to be like really big and chunky, and now we got these really cool smartphones like that you get to play with. That's like evolution. It's just like as things continue progressing, they get better and different, or they get different, and sometimes they get better. That's a great explanation of evolution for like that age group, and that gets them to think about it. I am not going to talk about allele frequency and this is what a nucleotide is, and here's what a mutation is, and here's all. I'm not going to talk about different phyla and taxa and all this, and here's how we classify life. And when you see is this is the origin of speech, it's just pointless to do that. And so, like, could I get there? Sure. If I wanted to have a serious conversation with a 5-year-old about evolution, that's not the way that's going to go. And so, like, when you talk about like sex and gender, just as your example there, if I were explaining to a kid, like, what this means, I could say something like very simple, like, sometimes, it's not as easy as you might think to tell who's a boy and a girl. And there's actually some people that are neither, that are actually just kind of their own thing. And you just gotta let them tell you what they're comfortable with you calling them. And that's an easy way. I can very simply break that down. Like, yeah, most of the people you're going to meet are boys and girls, but there's some people that aren't. And you shouldn't really assume, because you should really ask. It's a little bit more polite that way. The same way you would ask people's name. You wouldn't just go up and call somebody John. You would ask them if their name is, whatever, unless it's this guy, then you can. But like, it's just like there's a simple way to explain that isn't getting into here's the complexities of the multivariate system that is biological sex. Here's what hormones and genes and chromosomes are. And here's what gender is, And so, and you're also correct to say the simple explanation is a lot easier. And that's what we see a lot of the time in like regressive politics and ideologies is like, it's much more complicated to deal with the historical existence of trans and non-binary people, to deal with the anthropological evidence, the ethnographic evidence, to deal with all these different cultures that have had multiple genders, to talk about our own culture for hundreds and hundreds of years, the way that gender roles and ideas have progressed and changed and evolved in our own culture. All of this stuff is stuff that takes at least like high school level, maybe even early college level education to really grapple. And most people in this country. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry. So I mean, say that we took an approach, right? Like with your example of sex and gender, like explaining to a 5-year-old where because again, like I understand that we can say like, some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are neither. But I'd say the more complex understanding, the one that we're trying to distill into like a simplified version, right? Comes down to like, it's not just the reality, right, that we face is like sometimes there are people that are boys that understand themselves as girls, right? Or sometimes there's girls that understand themselves as boys and they go from one to the other. Like, say you took an approach where you like address that nuance. Obviously, you can't go into like, sex as a constellation of traits, and things aren't always 100% aligned. But
and
you
gender
still
is a
like
completely
acknowledge.
different thing. Yeah. And and that's what you can do. You can say, you can use words like feeling, because kids understand feelings really well. That's all they have. They don't have a lot of thoughts yet, but they have big feelings. And so like you can use a word like that. You can make it very, very simplified in a way that a Fox News anchor would hate, and say, like, oh, this person feels more like a girl the way you feel more like a boy. And do you feel like a boy sometimes? Maybe you don't. Maybe you might feel a different way. It's really up to you to explore. Today I feel happy, and today I feel sad, and today's whatever. So like if you consistently, you find that for a long time you feel this way about yourself, then that's true to you, and you can explore that a little more when you get older. Like that's a totally fine way to talk about that without getting into nuance of, actually, because sex and gender are different things, you can have someone who is a female but is also a boy, because those are different words that mean different things, that have different concepts behind them, and different and so when we're talking about this, we are talking about gender identity, but it's not actually just a feeling. It's actually a little bit more complex than that, and there's a massive amount of like psychological and sociological discussion to have here. And like this is what that
I would agree that it's
so just
definitely like more than a feeling.
Put the word feeling in there for a kid, that's good enough to understand, because kids understand what a feeling is. You know what I mean? They understand what that means to like think about who you are. And okay, what does it feel like when you think about who you are? Well, when this person thinks about who they are, they feel like a girl. And it turns out that, that you can look at them and they look a lot like all the other girls, so it's okay. You can call them her. And this other person doesn't really feel like either. It just doesn't really work for them. And so they're doing their own thing. So it's really polite to just use they or them to talk to them about that person, and get to know them a little bit better. And maybe you'll learn something about yourself by learning about them. You'll learn how different you are. And that's awfully fun, to learn about the differences between us, and to celebrate how interesting and how different we all are. And we all special and all so cool. And like, that's a thing you can.
That's kind of what I mean though about I feel like that's kind of what I mean though about the nuance of the gas, right? Where like, instead of like going into like a more like kind of exploring the nuance and exploring like why sometimes, a person is experiencing their boyness or girlness as a feeling, right? Like we kind of appeal to this larger, like, everything is, kind of complicated and there's lots of exceptions in nature, which there are. But like, for instance, I would maybe explain it as, the reason why someone might feel like a boy or like a girl is because there's lots of different, when we look at someone as a boy or we look at someone like a girl, there's, people are made of lots of parts, and sometimes all those parts aren't always aligned in one direction or another. So, kind of like diving into
the issue is it depends on what age group you're talking about, but you are conflating sex and gender there if you're talking about physical parts and words like boy and girl. But like that's fine.
And that's always been kind of
if you want to scale
for me,
it up,
it's always been for me, it's always been kind of it's been harder, I guess, for me to distinguish, because I'm both intersex and trans. I was born an intersex male with Bailey-Chappelle syndrome, and I transitioned over to I guess now an intersex female, or however one would define that. And I guess a lot of times I feel like some of the complexity in my own biological condition isn't like terms like gender or feelings kind of over like, and there's truth to them. Like I would never deny it that there isn't, but like I feel like it kind of oversimplifies some of the more complicated understandings of like how sex traits manifest, how sex differentiation manifests in certain aspects of the overall biological system. Like, neurology. To give a little background, like my background is in what I majored in was genetic engineering and evolutionary neurology, kind of like how the yeah. I don't know if you know what like Luca is, like last universal common ancestor. But okay, cool. So like kind of like the abiogenesis hypothesis of like how the central nervous system evolved, like from chemical evolution into like DNA. Obviously, like that's super complicated, but
it's a long time.
my neuroscience, like very long. But my kind of understanding of gender as like almost an aspect of sex differentiation, and it's more complicated than just sex traits. There's obviously a sociological and like societal lens that we, that's how we know that like usually that's like the main signal. And for me, like I might be intersex, but like even if I wasn't, I still would have known something was wrong, because I didn't see myself in any human beings that had the sex characteristics that I appeared to have on the outside. And sometimes aspects of a person's biological sex aren't as easy to detect by looking at them, right? Like whether you're talking about gonads or you're talking about neurology. I feel like a lot of times that those aspects of like the more complicated aspects of biological sex and gender, like, as a sociological construct, sometimes it's kind of oversimplified. And I kind of, if anything, I'm looking for advice of like, how do you kind of bring up those nuances and like discuss those complexities in ways that are like more accessible to people that, don't seem overly intellectualized.
You're talking about just the nuance of how to talk about sex and gender in this way specifically?
Yeah, well, like, I guess more so like the mechanisms, right? Like how, like if we think of like consciousness, right? Like we go from neurons to like how they connect into larger systems, into like thoughts and then systems, right? Like how do we do the same thing with sex and like how gender evolves from that?
I would say it like the way that I would usually present it is like if I'm speaking to somebody who's an adult and is not a scientist, so we got a muggle, and they are interested in this topic, but they're not academic, and this just really not their. And I'm not trying to like overwhelm them with a bunch of shit, right? So I would start by just saying that sex is a multidimensional construct with lots of different factors that go into it, and not a single one of those factors is solely determinate. Yeah, is not a single one of those factors is solely determinant of the outcome, and not a single one of those factors has only two options. So you have this really wide array, and you can do like the old plot, the graph where they do like multidimensional analysis, and you have a bimodal system, and nobody understands what the X is because the X is like the sum total of all these different characteristics and all their possibilities, right? And so I would say it to that way that sex is this very, very, very convoluted thing. And if you in 6th grade learn XX means female, okay, well, here's this person I'm talking to right now with De La Chapelle syndrome that actually either because of an epistasis situation, either because of an epistasis situation or translocation of part or all of the SRY gene or whatever other reason. There's a reason why it's called syndrome. It's because it doesn't mean there isn't one guaranteed cause, right? You have this person with XX chromosomes you are genetically male, chromosomally female, anatomically male, hormonally female. Like you've got this mismatch. And so putting people like mixed that traits, using an intersex trait as an example to get people into this headspace of, okay, so this is a little bit more complicated. So now what do I call this person? Well, that is one of the reasons why gender is different. Transgender and intersex are different concepts, right? And we can talk about gender in a minute. But for right now, let's say we talk about somebody with Swyer syndrome, right? So here's somebody with XY allosomes who has a vulva and a vagina and a uterus and uterine tubes and ovaries and like all of this whole situation. They are anatomically and phenotypically female, but they're chromosomally male. What do we do with this person? Either you must accept that some men can get pregnant and give birth, or you must accept that some women have XY chromosomes, or you can split sex from gender and this makes total sense. This person is rare, but not outside of the realm of possibility. They're very interesting, but they make sense, right? And they're no longer this anomaly that needs to be justified. They're just a person.
It's like,
and then if we really want to get into gender, sorry, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I'll make it quick. I was just going to say, like, when we look at someone with mixed traits like me, I mean, you asked the question, like, what do we call that person? Like, I think, I can look at myself as like a conglomerate of like body parts, or I can look at myself as a human being. And the part of my biology that makes me human, that is also sex differentiated, since sex differentiation affects every aspect of biology, whether you're looking at bones or genitals or reproductive, whatever. Like, the part of our biology that makes us human is, comes down to our minds. And, if you extrapolate that into a soul to get philosophical or whatever, like, sure, but like, that's why we call people what they want to be called, because we're acknowledging the part of their biology that makes them more than just, objectified parts, but like an actual human being.
Right. Well, and that's the thing, is that like, if you approach it from this way of like showing the models, you know what I'm saying? Like I can sit here and explain to you the history of gender in Western culture, and like how differently men in the 1600s were expected to paint their faces, to weep, to faint with emotion, to wear high heels, and all these things, like all these things in the 1600s that you certainly would not consider manly today, right?
No,
and explaining the history of like, right, and the most masculine thing you could do was put on all sorts of brightly colored makeup and walk around with a handkerchief waving and all, and so like that's I could explain this, or I can just show you the utility of the system. Right. It's the same way I can explain evolution. I can break this stuff down, or I can just say, if evolution is true, the world should look like this, and this is what we see in the world. Therefore, we can see this model works. If sex and gender are different, we should see if sex and gender are non-synonymous and non-binary, we should see a variety of different gender presentations and a variety of different sex presentations, even within the same population, and we do. If sex and gender are non-synonymous and non-binary, we should see a history of different gender presentations that span across time and across cultures, with multiple cultures existing at the same time, with vastly different gender roles or numbers of genders that they accept, while the same sex conditions and sex gradient exists among all of them. And that is indeed what we see. If sex and gender are non-synonymous and non-binary, then we should be able to see the presentation of humans be somewhat spectral, with even what we would traditionally call male and female having a little bit of variety and having a continuum of variation between the two major nodes. And also, no matter where we are on that line, we should find people who identify and present themselves in different ways, as we can see that gender identity, gender presentation, and gender roles in the society are all distinctly different things that come together to make one construct called gender. And that is exactly what we see. And so like, that's the way that I would present it to them, in a way that would like show how it works. Does that make sense?
It does. Let me ask you this, Forrest. What if you would use the word gender to refer to, let's say, like the social roles that like we associate commonly with like biological sex differentiation, assuming everyone's endosexual, right? What word would you use to describe, let's say, someone's neurological sex differentiation, if you would even distinguish that from gender in the first place?
I would. Whenever I'm talking about sex, because like, just even if you ignore intersex people, right? You say everybody's endosexual, love this. So like, even if we do that, that doesn't change the fact that like sex is still has different levels. And so like chromosomal sex is still different than anatomical sex, is still different than hormonal sex, is still different than gonadal sex, is still different than gametic sex, whatever you want to talk about, right? And so if I was talking about somebody's brain and I'm pointing to like, the idea that trans people have neural architecture that aligns with their gender identity more than their genitalia, then yeah, I would absolutely use that as a way to talk about a biological basis of gender. But I would also be very sure to point out that, just like with, say, for example, sexuality, right? There are brain markers. There are brain markers that tend to point in one direction for like homosexuals versus heterosexuals, for example. There are brain behaviors that point in this direction as well, because a lot of time when we talk about brain sex and brain gender, saying males and female brains is about as useful as saying male or female hearts or male or female lungs. It just doesn't really work. However, we do see
that's why I would distinguish between like that's why I would distinguish between brain and neurology.
Yeah, so we do see male or female activation patterns that tend to follow along gender lines, right? And that's
especially with hormone regulated patterns.
Absolutely. So like if we're talking about like sexuality, we can say there are activation patterns of homosexuals that look like, if a homosexual person is in a brain scanner looking at a picture of someone of the same sex, their brain lights up in the same way as a heterosexual person looking at someone of the opposite sex. So we have these activation patterns that we can trace. Same thing works for gender. I can now make this connection. And I can also say that just like with sexuality, where it is next to impossible to boil down all of somebody's very complex feelings about who they're attracted to and how they're attracted to them, difference between romantic attraction versus sexual attraction versus erotic attraction versus all these different things, all this down into one single box that I can then reliably apply to literally anybody else. That's fucking insane. That's why there's so many people who are demisexual, pansexual, whatever. It's hard to keep track of sometimes. Same thing then applies to gender. If you can tell, even if I can in some way boil down everything I can tell you about me being a man and what that means to me, guarantee it doesn't 100% apply the same way to John sitting next to me here. We have a different concept of what man means, and that's fine. And so that's the way that I would present that. And so I would say, yes, there is a biological basis for like gender presentation, gender activation. Sex is related to gender. No one's arguing it isn't, but it is a different thing. And when we look at how gender actually presents, that varies from culture to culture, generation to generation, person to person, day to day. And that's a big important, that is the nuance that now you don't want to get into either, because I fucking promise you, we will be here all day talking about it and getting nowhere. That's where nuance is useful. You know what I'm saying?
So to clarify, are you saying that you would distinguish between like gender as a social role and gender as a biological basis of like neurological sex differentiation, or would you still say they're separate things? Because I'm very interested in like, are they separate? Like, should there, we can talk about like brain sex, right? But like, we don't necessarily have to say a person's entire brain is male or female to say, hey, this, essential component of the brain that like is related to cognition or information processing or emotional regulation takes on a more, male or female pattern, or, is influenced by like certain hormone levels that are present. Like, how would you, if we took like the neural architecture approach of like, all right, this specific aspect of the neural architecture, how it sex differentiates, how that relates to identity, would you distinguish that? Would you still say that that's distinct from like the overall concept of gender? Or would you say that like gender as like a social role construct, right? Or would you say that like it's just a part of gender, like a kind of a smaller component or a distinct component of it?
I would say I would distinguish them. At the very worst, I would say it's a, for lack of a better word, a risk factor for gender. I don't know of a better way to phrase that. I'm extremely tired, but like there's, I would point to that and just say that like, there are, male typical or female typical neural architecture, male typical, female typical activation patterns. However, it's important to point out that like internal review of these things, like when we look like the highest level of like review studies, these structures are neither internally consistent nor like reliable, and they're highly variable across populations. And so like it's really tough to say this person has these parts of the brain with that are these volumes and activation patterns that look like this, and then make that diagnostic to say, okay, well, this person is X amount of likely to be a boy. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's reasonable to do. I'm not a neuroscientist. I would be talking out of my ass if I tried to stretch that any farther than I could.
Yeah.
But like,
so
I would still distinguish them because I think it is complicated. It's nuanced. And I would tell you that like, I think out of all that, the main takeaway is that like, I would still separate them because that model fits reality better still. And if there's more to it to learn, then we need somebody like you who's a neurologist that can get in there and figure it out for us. So I'm excited to see what your research yields in the future and what you can figure out, because I want to know. And I'll let you know next time. I'm thinking about going back to study psychology pretty soon. And so I'll let you know if I learn anything cool or new about that specifically. It'd be tight. Anyway,
you're definitely right. It is complicated.
We've got a very little bit of time left, but I really appreciate you, Mila. Thank you so much for calling and talking to us about this. It was a lot of fun.
Of course. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great night.
See you later. Bye-bye.